Welcome back. It's now time to get started with the nuts and bolts of doing your literature review. There are perhaps 6 steps to writing a good literature review. Step number 1, obviously, is finding good literature that is relevant to your project. Step 2 is building a database of that literature that will help you analyse and then cite that literature into your reports. Step 3 is about reading the literature critically. Step 4 is around making notes about the literature to allow you to analyse it. And step 5 is actually writing the review and drawing conclusions. So let's think about finding good literature. Perhaps the go-to place in the library website is this web address, where various sources of literature that are relevant to infrastructure engineering have been gathered together, as long as with information about ways of conducting research, citing materials, and so forth. The important thing to do early is to identify a seminal or important paper on the topic that you are interested in. So the way to do this is look for the journal papers and how to find those journal papers. And when searching for a paper, put in just a couple of keywords that are critical to your area and sort the results by how many citations that these papers have received. A citation is the fact that someone else has referred to this particular paper in their own research work. And so if you can find a paper with many citations, it is likely to be of more importance than a paper that has received no citations. So in doing that search, you might search for papers with the word review in the titles or keywords. Review papers are often written that bring together a wide range of information on a particular topic, and therefore are good places to start with your literature review. You can look at papers cited by and papers citing important papers. So once again, from the database search, the papers that have cited a particular paper you found can usually be found directly in that in the database tools, and then you might also go to papers that are citing because they have happened more recently. So you might have found a review paper written in 2010 and there's a paper written in 2015 that cites the first paper. Now, of course, because it's only been written this year, this paper may not have citations of its own, even though it might be an important paper. So using the list of references and citations is an important way to expand your literature review. As you begin to find a few papers, you can discover the keywords that authors in this area are using and then use those to expand your search. Often the technical language that's used may not be familiar to you, so use words out of the title and other keywords from papers to expand your search. Just a couple of words of warning. There are many things available on the internet, both from the journal databases and from other sources. You need to treat these documents with caution. You need to be critical in evaluating them. So government documents cover a very broad spectrum of quality. Some contain critical information that is of highly significant value and very reliable, while other government documents might be driven by just political interests and so may not contain high quality information. Similarly, information from manufacturers and various interest groups needs to be treated with caution. It's not to say that this information is not useful, but you just need to think about what were the motivations of the people who wrote that information and the fact that it will probably reflect their interest and also probably won't have been reviewed by their peers. So step 2 is about building your database of literature. As you are finding literature, import it into your information management database. Examples of these are EndNote or RefWorks, which are both available from the library website, or Mendeley, which is an online publicly available database for managing references and papers and comments on those papers. You need to work out a strategy to work with your team. If you've got several people working on your project, each of these pieces of software offers ways to share papers found and comments that you've made with your team. Then I would suggest you need to work out a strategy to read a paper. As you get it into the database, you will almost certainly have the title and the abstract, because that can be imported directly into the database. But at the stage when you find the paper, I would encourage you probably to read the introduction and conclusions and make some notes on those directly into the database, just to ensure that that's an important paper that you want to persist with. For many papers, you wouldn't want to read more than that at this stage until you have found the range of papers that might be interesting to your project. So we talk about this idea of critical review. So when we say critical, we don't necessarily mean in a negative sense. It means reading it in relation to the problem that you have provisionally identified. How does this literature relate to your interest? Because the paper that's been written has probably been written with another purpose in mind, and you need to reinterpret what has been written in this paper that relates to your problem. You need to identify what material is relevant to your research. There is much literature out there, and you'll end up with a very long list of papers if you don't hone down literature that is directly relevant to your research. It can still be relevant if it comes from a different discipline. So there might be a research technique that you can borrow from medicine or science or chemistry or music that might be relevant to your particular project, and these papers are often actually quite difficult to find, but if you can borrow a good method from another discipline, that might be just what's needed to make progress in your area. You will be finding your papers one at a time, but they will be part of a network. So discovering what this network of interrelationships in the literature is very important. Are there particular groups of papers that go together? Are there two competing theories? Are there chronologically, were there papers that were discovered earlier that led to subsequent discoveries? So don't just think about papers as individuals, think about the papers as a network, and the relationships between those papers is important. So making notes as you read the literature is very important. So I would suggest on the first reading, having looked at the abstract and the introduction, you will be able to find very quickly what was the key aim of that particular paper, what method that they used. Was it an experiment, a survey, a numerical model, a theoretical investigation? What method was used? What were the key findings and the conclusions? In your database management software, there are fields that you can edit to put in your interpretation of these items, and that will help you begin to classify the papers. So make these notes directly in the database so that they don't become separated from the source. You might also try to identify if papers had limitations, because this will enrich your review, and it is the limitations of papers that might represent the gap in knowledge that you could potentially fill. At this stage, you need to be aware of plagiarism. It is very easy to copy a phrase from literature and not keep it associated with its source. So if you are copying phrases in the literature in order to put in the notes section of your software, make sure you enclose that copy in quotation marks and note the page number and because it's in the database it will be associated with the source. And so therefore if you come back later and you want to use that as part of your report, then you will have the bibliographic details to hand and know whether it was a quotation or whether it was your paraphrasing that you had listed in the software. So now it's time to write the review and draw your conclusions. So in your written review, you need to communicate a number of things. You need to communicate that you know the knowledge base. Okay, so you have to convince the reader that you're knowledgeable on the literature that surrounds the topic that you're interested in. You need, via logical comparison and analysis of the evidence within the literature, what are the gaps and edges of current knowledge, or what areas are rather shallowly treated in the literature compared to those that are treated in depth. You need to decide at this stage which of those gaps that you plan to address, perhaps via a hypothesis or prediction you plan to test. There might be many gaps and there might be restrictions in regard to your prior knowledge or resources and so forth that you can't address all the gaps. You need to choose the ones that suit you. And finally, you need to summarise what the literature says about the techniques that past researchers have used in similar situations, because this will guide your choice of methodology and method, which is the next step in your project. So, what next? I would suggest, in order to get started, go to the LibGuides infrastructure website, and with the assistance of guidance from that page, find your first review paper in the journal literature. Once you've found that first paper, get that paper into your database software. Now this might mean that you have to download the software, learn how to use it, learn how to import the citation from the database into your software. But if you do this with your very first paper, then you'll be able to do it more efficiently with subsequent papers. My suggestion as the next step is to read the paper, How to Read a Scientific Paper. You will find this in the resources section on the Learning Management System site for the subject. And finally, just a word of advice, literature reviews are hard work. It can take a long time to sort through what is relevant. You might be reading papers that are somewhat beyond your current level of knowledge, and so they're difficult to read, and keeping up motivation is difficult. So I would suggest that you review your project plan and set some milestones for your literature. It might be that you set a milestone of each day for the next 2 weeks that you find a new paper that is relevant to your topic, and read that paper and get the notes into your database. So set yourself some relatively easy to achieve milestones, but also frequent milestones in order to get yourself started.